They asked France to trade its gold for a story, and the story paid out for a while. Paper promises multiplied, streets filled with hopeful crowds, and for a few fevered months a gambler named John Law seemed to have taught an old monarchy a new language of money. How did a bet on Louisiana become a test of a nation's faith in its own currency? France, exhausted by decades of war and the debts of Louis XIV, was brittle the moment John Law arrived. A Scot by birth and a gambler by habit law, persuaded the regent Philippe d'Orléans to let him try something radical, a private bank that issued paper notes and a trading company that would, in theory, turn colonial promise into real wealth. He folded the bank and the company into a single system that would centralize state debt, create liquidity, and replace heavy coin with paper. For a while, the machinery worked. Businesses grew, shipping increased, and Paris buzzed as if a new money had been found. Those were not illusions, but they were built on a fragile understanding of value that rested more on confidence than coin. Law's company, known in Paris by its romantic name, the Mississippi Company, did more than trade. It swallowed competing chartered companies, seized tobacco and West African trade rights, and promised enormous returns from lands barely known to most Europeans. The company's shares became available to anyone with a livre to spare, and people from courtiers to cobblers queued for paper that represented a faraway empire. Enthusiasm fed itself. Rising share prices created demand for more notes, which in turn pushed prices higher. In just a few years, the value of a share rose from a few hundred livres to a price that would astonish the age. The spectacle turned the Rue Quincampoix into an arena of speculation, and Paris into a city that believed the future could pay for the present. When price becomes proof, reality has its own way of disagreeing. The company's growth was real in some respects. Ships sailed, New Orleans was founded, and commerce increased. But much of the value lived in promises that depended on perpetual appetite for more paper and more shares. As confidence wavered, the same mechanism that had inflated prices began to work in reverse. Investors rushed to convert notes back into specie. The bank, swamped by redemptions, first limited withdrawals and then closed briefly, moves meant to buy time, but which read to ordinary people like an admission of emptiness. Panic did the rest. Shares that had seemed indestructible collapsed. Paper that had felt as good as gold was suddenly suspect. John Law, the architect of the system, was turned from visionary to scapegoat and sent into exile as the state quietly absorbed the wreckage. The human scenes in Paris that summer of 1720 were brutal and oddly modern. Where once there had been hope, there were now long lines outside bank windows, furious shouts, and desperate hands trying to push through to tellers. Contemporary accounts speak of crowds so panicked that people were trampled. Some died in the crush as the promise of easy riches curdled into fear. Small investors, widows, small shopkeepers, civil servants were left with paper that no longer bought bread the way coin did. The political cost was immediate. The regent's prestige suffered, public trust in the state's financial claims was shattered, and taxes and policy were reshaped to cover losses the nation had been asked to underwrite. The Mississippi bubble did not just break markets. It broke faith. Why did this happen, beyond the obvious greed and gullibility? There is a logic to bubbles that is both economic and human. A heavy load of public debt made France eager for any mechanism that promised repayment without immediate pain. Law's system offered a seductive shortcut: roll debt into equity, pay out creditors in shares and notes, and grow the economy until the numbers look right. That logic can work when growth is real and bank discipline is strong. It fails when expansion outruns underlying productive capacity, or when a central figure controls both the bank and the asset he is selling. The Mississippi episode is a textbook of leverage and moral hazard. When the same hands print the money and sell the dream, incentives twist in predictable and dangerous ways. Which of our modern arrangements quietly replicate those same incentives? The lessons echo in our own time. Look at the technology bubbles, the mortgage excesses, the rapid creation of new credit instruments. Each era dresses its faith in new clothes. Telecom towers, dot-com platforms, mortgage-backed securities. But the pattern is constant. Innovation plus easy credit plus social appetite for quick gain. The Mississippi taught that a nation can be undone not only by lack of gold, but by a loss of credibility. Money, after all, lives in people's heads as much as it lives in vaults. When belief erodes, the ledger is meaningless. Without that trust, a currency is nothing more than ink on paper. No modern regulator or central banker has ever been able to fully legislate away that basic fact. What then becomes the right balance between innovation and caution? There are quieter, less moralizing outcomes to this story, too. John Law's experiment left a complicated legacy. It was partly a failure and partly an experiment that foreshadowed modern central banking and fiat money. Law showed how credit could lubricate commerce and increase the velocity of money, and some of his reforms, standardized accounting, encouragement of commerce and centralized financial markets, informed later, more stable systems. But those technical gains came at the cost of a political memory that made Europeans suspicious of paper money for decades. The story is not a single moral, but a set of trade-offs: growth versus stability, imagination versus prudence, private profit versus public trust. Which of those trade-offs should a society privilege when money itself is on trial? If you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes of 1720 in the rhythms of our markets, a whisper of new schemes, a chorus of boosters, and then sudden silence when the music stops. The Mississippi Bubble is not merely a museum piece. It is a mirror that shows how financial systems translate private desire into public consequence. It asks us to look at who is selling the future, what guarantees are behind the paper, and what happens when a nation is asked to believe a story it cannot test. If this changed the way you see the history of money, there is more to uncover. The past does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes, and the Mississippi's lines still rhyme with our own. Stay with us, and we will trace the next verse in the long song of credit, power, and the human appetite. To make tomorrow, pay for today. And if this story changed the way you see money and empire, subscribe right now, because the next episode, that's where things get even deeper. The next ledger will show how nations borrowed the future to own the present. And trust me, you'll want to see what happens next.